February 19th, 1942. An elite Japanese naval aviator crash lands on a remote Australian island. He's armed with a revolver. He's trained for combat. And then a man with a tomahawk appears behind him. 2.5 years later, that captured pilot would sound a bugle at 2 a.m., triggering the largest prisoner of war escape in World War II history. 1,104 prisoners, 231 dead, and a story so remarkable that it connected two enemies across decades of reconciliation. I'm about to take you inside the Cowra Breakout of August 5th, 1944. You'll discover how an Indigenous Australian warrior made history with a traditional weapon, how Japanese prisoners planned the most audacious escape of the entire war, and how two Australian soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice that saved hundreds of lives. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this forgotten chapter of World War II matters more than you ever imagined. And here's what makes this even more powerful. The reconciliation that followed transformed enemies into friends, racism into recognition, and a battlefield into the largest Japanese garden in the Southern Hemisphere. If this is the kind of untold history that gives you chills, do me a favor and tap that like button right now. It helps more people discover stories that deserve to be remembered. Now, let's go back to that moment on Melville Island when everything began. February 19th, 1942. The Japanese Empire is at the height of its power. Just weeks earlier, Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Now they're hitting Darwin, Australia's northern gateway. Among the attacking pilots is Hajime Toyoshima, a naval aviator from the carrier Hiryu. He'd participated in patrols during the Pearl Harbor operation. He was elite. He was experienced, and on this day, his luck ran out. Anti-aircraft fire tears into his plane during the Darwin raid. Toyoshima manages to crash land on Melville Island, just off Australia's northern coast. He survives the crash, he's armed with his service revolver, and according to everything in his training, according to the Bushido code he's been raised with, capture is not an option. Capture means disgrace. Capture means your family believes you're better off dead. So when he emerges from that wreckage, he's dangerous, he's desperate, and he's determined not to be taken alive. Enter Matthias Ulungura. He's a 21-year-old Tiwi Islander. And here's where this story takes its first incredible turn. Matthias cannot officially enlist in the Australian military. Not because he's unqualified, not because he's unwilling, but because of the racial restrictions of the era that barred Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from military service. Despite this injustice, Matthias serves anyway, working as a bodyguard to Corporal Moore at the RAAF base on Melville Island. When word spreads that a Japanese pilot has crash-landed, Matthias doesn't hesitate. He grabs a tomahawk, not a gun, a traditional axe, and he goes hunting for a trained military pilot armed with a revolver. Think about the courage that takes. Think about the skill required. This isn't Hollywood. This is a man with a hand tool facing an armed, desperate enemy aviator on unfamiliar terrain. Here's what happened next, in Matthias Ulungura's own words. Quote, "I walked after him and grabbed his wrist near gun. He got proper big fright. I take revolver from his right side near his knee. Then I walk backwards pointing gun. I say, 'Stick 'em up, 2 hands. No more holding hands on head.'" End quote. Let that image sink in. An Indigenous Australian warrior, barred from official military service because of his race, creeps up behind an elite Imperial Japanese Navy pilot with a tomahawk, surprises him, disarms him, and captures him. Hajime Toyoshima becomes Australia's first Japanese prisoner of war of World War II. Not captured by a battalion, not captured by superior firepower, captured by one man with a traditional weapon and extraordinary bravery. But here's the tragic irony that Matthias couldn't have known. The man he captured with such courage would remain relatively obscure for decades. It wouldn't be until 1985, 5 years after Matthias died, that a memorial cairn would be erected in his honor. It wouldn't be until 2016 that a bronze statue would finally commemorate his achievement. Meanwhile, the prisoner he captured was about to become the central figure in the most dramatic prison escape of the entire war. Drop a comment right now and tell me if you'd heard of Matthias Ulungura before this video. His story deserves to be known. And if you're learning something remarkable, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. The story gets even more intense from here. So Hajime Toyoshima is now a prisoner. And for a Japanese naval aviator raised in the Bushido tradition, this is worse than death. The shame is so profound that Toyoshima adopts a false name. He calls himself Tadao Minami. Why? So that if word gets back to Japan, his family will never know their son was captured. They'll believe he died honorably in combat rather than live with the disgrace of knowing he surrendered. Think about that level of cultural shame. Think about what it means to erase your own identity because capture is considered more disgraceful than death. This isn't a minor detail. This psychological reality is the key to understanding everything that's about to happen at Cowra. By January 8th, 1943, Toyoshima arrives at Cowra Prisoner of War Camp in central west New South Wales, about 220 miles west of Sydney. The camp is roughly circular, divided into 4 compounds labeled A, B, C, and D. 2 internal roads cross the camp, one called Broadway running north to south, another called No Man's Land running east to west. Compounds A and C hold Italian prisoners captured during the North Africa campaigns. Compound D holds Japanese officers, along with Korean and Chinese conscripted laborers. And Compound B, where Toyoshima is housed, contains 1,104 Japanese enlisted men and naval aviators. This is the powder keg. Now, here's what you need to understand about the difference between these prisoners. The Italian POWs, by most accounts, largely accepted their imprisonment. They were being treated according to the 1929 Geneva Convention standards. The conditions were humane. They had adequate food, shelter, medical care. For many Italian soldiers who'd been fighting in the brutal North African desert campaigns, being a POW in Australia wasn't the worst outcome. But the Japanese prisoners? Completely different mindset. According to the Britannica Encyclopedia, they found surrender, quote, humiliating and disgraceful. They chafed at their confinement, not because the Australians were mistreating them, but because they were alive and captured instead of dead and honored. Many adopted aliases like Toyoshima did. They wanted their families to believe they were dead rather than face the shame of survival. The camp had security measures: 3 barbed wire fences surrounding the compound, 6 guard towers positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. Each tower gave guards clear sight lines across the camp. And here's a critical detail that shows just how close the Australians came to preventing this entirely. In June of 1944, 2 full months before the breakout, a Korean prisoner warned the Australian guards about a planned mass escape attempt. This wasn't a vague rumor. This was specific intelligence about coordinated planning among the Japanese prisoners. The Australians took it seriously. They responded by positioning 2 Vickers machine guns strategically around Compound B. These were heavy machine guns, British-designed, capable of sustained fire, the kind of weapons that could cut down waves of attacking infantry. The Australians knew something was coming. They'd been warned. They'd fortified their positions. They just didn't know when the attack would happen or how massive the scale would be. The guards were from the 22nd Garrison Battalion. Now, this is important context. These weren't frontline combat troops fresh from jungle warfare in New Guinea. They weren't hardened veterans of the Kokoda track campaign. They were garrison soldiers, primarily tasked with guarding prisoners of war far from any active battlefield. Many were older soldiers, or those deemed unfit for frontline service. Their job was to maintain order in a POW camp that was supposed to be following Geneva Convention standards. Nothing in their training or experience prepared them for what was about to happen. Think about their perspective. They're guarding prisoners who, by all official accounts, are being treated humanely. Adequate food, medical care, living conditions that meet international standards. The Italian prisoners in compounds A and C aren't causing problems. The camp has been operating for years without major incident. Yes, there was that warning in June, and yes, they've increased security. But night after night passes without incident. You start to wonder if the intelligence was accurate. You start to relax just a little. On the night of August 4th, 1944, there were guards on duty manning the towers, conducting routine patrols, monitoring the compound. But nothing in their experience, nothing in the quiet of that night, suggested that within hours, the largest prisoner of war escape in World War II history was about to explode in fire, violence, and chaos. So, what triggered it? What turned months of planning into immediate action? Here's the catalyst, and it's a perfect example of how following the rules can sometimes trigger the very thing you're trying to prevent. On the evening of August 4th, camp officials informed the prisoners in Compound B that they would be transferred to Hay POW camp about 250 miles to the west, roughly a full day's journey inland. Now, Article 26 of the 1929 Geneva Convention required advance notification of prisoner transfers. The Australians weren't being cruel. They weren't trying to provoke anyone. They were literally following international law, giving prisoners proper notice before moving them. By the letter of the law, they were doing everything right. But for the Japanese prisoners, this notification became the trigger that turned planning into action. According to the Britannica Encyclopedia, this news provided, quote, the impetus for the breakout. But why would a routine transfer announcement trigger such a dramatic response? Let me break down the psychology here because it's crucial to understanding what happened next. First, a transfer meant separation. The 1,104 men in Compound B had been together for months, some for over a year. They'd formed bonds, they'd coordinated planning. They knew who was reliable, who had skills, who could be counted on in a crisis. A transfer would scatter them, potentially mixing them with different prisoners, putting them under new guards who might be more vigilant. Second, it meant uncertainty. Where exactly were they going? What would conditions be like? Would they have the same opportunities for planning and coordination? Would their improvised weapons be discovered during the move? Every variable introduced by a transfer was a threat to whatever escape plans were already in motion. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it created urgency. If they were going to act, if they were going to attempt what they'd been planning, it had to be now, tonight, before the transfer could happen, before they were separated, searched, moved, and scattered. The window of opportunity was closing, and closing fast. For prisoners who'd been contemplating mass escape, who'd been manufacturing improvised weapons over months, who'd been coordinating roles and tactics in secret conversations, this was the moment of decision. Act now, or potentially never get another chance. And so, the decision was made. The date would be August 5th, 1944. The time would be approximately 2 a.m., when most guards would be at their lowest alertness, when darkness would provide cover, when the element of surprise would be maximized. The date is August 5th, 1944. The time is approximately 2 a.m. In Compound B, 1,104 Japanese prisoners are about to attempt the impossible, and the signal to begin falls to one man, Hajime Toyoshima, the same pilot captured by a Tomahawk-wielding Indigenous warrior on Melville Island 2.5 years earlier, the same man living under a false name, the same aviator who'd participated in operations connected to Pearl Harbor. Now, he's been chosen for a critical role. At 2 a.m., Toyoshima sounds an unauthorized bugle call. This is the signal. According to Australian war historian Gavin Long's official account, the bugle triggered coordinated attacks with banzai charges. That bugle, by the way, is now in the Australian War Memorial Collection, accession number REL/04058. You can see the actual instrument that started the largest POW escape in history. Here's what happened in the next hour, and the level of coordination is staggering when you understand the details. Most of Compound B's sleeping huts were set on fire, not randomly, not accidentally. This was coordinated arson designed to create chaos, illuminate the compound, and signal that the breakout had begun. The fires served multiple purposes. They destroyed evidence of planning. They created smoke and confusion. They forced guards to respond to multiple crises simultaneously. At least 900 Japanese prisoners were armed with improvised weapons they'd been making in secret for months. Let me emphasize that number. 900 armed prisoners out of 1,104 total. That means roughly 81% of the compound was actively participating in armed assault. This wasn't a small group of ringleaders with a handful of followers. This was overwhelming majority participation in what everyone knew would likely end in death. The weapons were improvised but deadly. Baseball bats, the kind used in camp recreation, now wielded as clubs. Knives, crafted from smuggled metal or stolen utensils, sharpened over weeks. Clubs with nails driven through them, creating medieval-style maces. Wire stilettos, thin enough to pierce between ribs. Garroting cords for silent killing. These men had been planning this for months, crafting weapons from whatever materials they could find or steal, hiding them in huts, under floorboards, in places. Guards wouldn't think to search during routine inspections. Think about the level of coordination required. You need weapon makers. You need smugglers to get materials. You need lookouts to warn when guards are coming. You need hiding places that won't be discovered. You need a system of communication that doesn't rely on language that guards might understand. And you need absolute commitment from nearly everyone in the compound, because one informant, one prisoner who talks, and the entire plan collapses. The prisoners split into tactical groups with specific objectives. This wasn't a mob mindlessly charging fences. This was organized military assault by trained soldiers who happened to be prisoners. Two groups hit the outer fences, attempting to breach the perimeter at different points. Divide the defenders' attention. Force them to respond to multiple breach attempts. Create confusion about where the main assault is coming from. Two groups went over the inner fences onto Broadway, the internal north-south road that divided the compounds. Their objectives were strategically chosen. First objective, breach Compound D, where the Japanese officers were held. If they could reach the officers, they could potentially get leadership, organization, and possibly even more fighters if the officers joined the escape attempt. Second objective, assault the camp's main north and south gates. These were the primary entry and exit points for the entire camp. If they could overwhelm the gates, they could flood into the surrounding Australian countryside in massive numbers that would be impossible to track down quickly. The Australian garrison opened fire immediately. The groups on Broadway were pinned down and neutralized, but the chaos was overwhelming. Fires lit up the night. Hundreds of prisoners were charging fences, scaling barbed wire, screaming battle cries. And at one of the Vickers machine gun positions, 2 Australian soldiers were about to become heroes. Hit that notification bell right now so you don't miss stories like this. We're at the climax of one of World War II's most dramatic moments, and what happens next will give you chills. Private Benjamin Gower Hardy and Private Ralph Jones were roused from sleep by the noise. They raced to one of the Vickers machine guns and began firing at prisoners who were scaling the outer fences and closing on them en masse. According to Britannica, dozens of prisoners were killed by the machine gun fire, but the numbers were overwhelming. 900 armed prisoners in coordinated assault. Hardy and Jones were vastly outnumbered. The prisoners got closer and closer. Hardy and Jones kept firing. They held their position as long as humanly possible, but they were about to be overrun, and in those final moments, these 2 men made a decision that would save countless lives. Before they were killed, Hardy and Jones disabled the Vickers machine gun. They rendered it inoperable so the Japanese prisoners couldn't turn it against other Australian defenders. Think about the presence of mind that requires. You're being overwhelmed. You know you're about to die. And instead of fleeing, instead of trying to save yourself, you destroy your weapon to protect others. Britannica states their action, quote, undoubtedly averted far greater bloodshed. If the prisoners had captured a functional Vickers machine gun, the casualties could have been catastrophic. Other guard towers, other defensive positions, all would have been vulnerable. Private Benjamin Gower Hardy and Private Ralph Jones were posthumously awarded the George Cross for their bravery. The George Cross is the highest civilian gallantry award in the British honours system, often given to military personnel for acts of extraordinary courage in non-combat situations. These men earned it. They paid with their lives, and they saved others in doing so. But the breakout wasn't over. Despite the machine gun fire, despite the Australian garrison's response, despite the bodies piling up at the fences, nearly 400 prisoners escaped into the surrounding countryside. 400 trained soldiers, many wounded, desperate, scattered across the farms and bushland of central New South Wales. Some had makeshift weapons. Some had nothing but determination. Most knew they would eventually be recaptured or killed. But in that moment, they were free from the cages, free from the shame of captivity, even if only temporarily. The Australian military mobilized immediately. This wasn't just a camp security issue anymore. This was a military emergency. Search parties formed within hours, comprised of garrison troops, local police, and volunteers who knew the terrain. Roadblocks went up on every major road leading out of Cowra. Patrols swept through farms, checking barns, sheds, any structure that could provide shelter. Local residents were warned to lock their doors and report any sightings. The manhunt was massive, methodical, and urgent. And here's what makes the recapture so remarkable. Within 9 to 10 days, all escapees were recaptured. Every single one. The Australian War Memorial records it as 9 days. Britannica says within 9 days. Wikipedia says 10 days. The slight variation in sources likely reflects when you start counting, but the point is the same. In less than 2 weeks, 400 escaped prisoners were found and returned to custody. Some were found hiding in the bush, cold, hungry, and exhausted. Some surrendered when exhaustion and hunger overwhelmed them, when the reality set in that there was nowhere to go, no friendly territory, no way to blend into the Australian population. Some were captured after brief confrontations when local farmers or police spotted them. But the Australian forces were thorough, methodical, and determined. They knew the terrain, they had numbers, and they had motivation. By mid-August 1944, the Cowra Breakout was over. Now let's talk about the human cost. 231 Japanese prisoners were killed or committed suicide during the breakout. That number is staggering. It's verified across multiple authoritative sources, including the Australian War Memorial, Britannica Encyclopedia, and detailed Wikipedia articles with extensive citations. 108 Japanese prisoners were wounded. Many of the deaths were suicides, consistent with the Bushido Code that viewed capture as disgraceful. For these men, the breakout wasn't primarily about escaping to freedom. For many, it was about dying in action rather than continuing to live in captivity. 4 Australian soldiers were killed: Private Hardy, Private Jones, and 2 additional guards whose deaths are documented but whose names vary slightly across sources. 3 Australian soldiers were wounded on the night of the breakout. When you consider that 1,104 prisoners launched a coordinated assault with improvised weapons, the fact that Australian casualties were limited to 4 killed and 3 wounded speaks to the effectiveness of the defense and the tragic reality that many prisoners were seeking death rather than escape. Among the Japanese dead was Hajime Toyoshima, the man whose story we started with. The naval aviator shot down during the Darwin raid. The pilot captured by Matthias Ulungura's Tomahawk on Melville Island. The prisoner who adopted the alias Tadao Minami to hide his shame. The bugler who sounded the call that started it all. He died from a gunshot wound to the chest and a self-inflicted wound to his throat. The combination of injuries suggests he was shot during the assault and then, in the tradition of Bushido, attempted to take his own life rather than face recapture. Think about the full arc of his story. In February 1942, he was an elite naval aviator flying combat missions from the carrier Hiryu, the same carrier that had participated in operations connected to Pearl Harbor. Within days, he was a prisoner, captured by a man with a traditional weapon, experiencing shame so profound he erased his own identity. For 2.5 years, he lived under a false name in captivity, planning, coordinating, waiting for a chance to either escape or die honorably. And on August 5, 1944, he got that chance. He sounded the bugle. He helped lead the largest prisoner of war escape in World War II history, and he died in the attempt. The man who became Australia's first Japanese POW through a Tomahawk capture died leading the largest POW escape attempt in World War II history. The irony is almost overwhelming. And here's the final twist to his story. He was buried under his alias Tadao Minami, the false name that was supposed to protect his family's honor. His true identity as Hajime Toyoshima wasn't discovered until the 1960s, more than 20 years after his death. For 2 decades, he lay in an unmarked grave under a name that wasn't his, unknown even in death. Today, his remains are interred at the Cowra Japanese War Cemetery, and his true name is finally known and recorded. I've linked some incredible resources in the description about the Cowra Breakout, including the Australian War Memorial's detailed documentation. If this story is resonating with you, share this video. These histories deserve to be remembered. So the breakout is over, the casualties are counted, the prisoners are secured, and in the immediate aftermath you might expect anger, resentment, maybe calls for revenge. But what happened instead is one of the most remarkable reconciliation stories of the post-war era. This is where the story transforms from tragedy to hope, from conflict to connection. In 1963, less than 20 years after the breakout, the Australian government ceded land near the former Cowra POW campsite to Japan for the construction of a Japanese war cemetery. Think about the significance of that. Australia, which lost 4 soldiers defending against the breakout, which suffered through years of brutal Pacific War combat against Japanese forces, voluntarily gave land for a cemetery to honor the Japanese prisoners who died at Cowra. The cemetery doesn't just contain those killed in the breakout, it also holds Japanese war dead from elsewhere in Australia and Japanese airmen shot down over Australian territory during the war. Adjacent to the Japanese cemetery is an Allied war cemetery containing 26 Australians, including the 4 soldiers killed in the Cowra Breakout, plus 1 British airman. Former enemies, buried near each other, honored equally. But the reconciliation went even further. In 1978, the Cowra Japanese Garden and Cultural Center was constructed. It was designed by the renowned landscape architect Ken Nakajima, and here's the superlative that captures its significance. It's the largest Japanese garden in the Southern Hemisphere. Not just a memorial, not just a gesture, a massive, beautiful, meticulously designed cultural center that celebrates Japanese culture in the heart of Australia. The garden strengthened ties between Cowra and Japan that continue to this day. Cowra, a town of about 10,000 people in rural New South Wales, has become a symbol of post-war reconciliation. Japanese visitors come to honor their war dead. Australian visitors come to learn history and appreciate Japanese culture. The story that began with a Tomahawk capture and exploded into the largest POW escape of World War II ended with friendship, gardens, and mutual respect. This is what reconciliation looks like. Not forgetting the past, not pretending the violence didn't happen, but acknowledging the humanity on both sides, honoring the dead, and building something beautiful for the future. Now let's return to Matthias Ulungura, because his story needs to complete this circle. Remember, Matthias captured Toyoshima with a Tomahawk in February 1942, making Toyoshima Australia's first Japanese POW. That was a historic achievement. He should have been celebrated immediately. He should have been recognized as a hero, but he wasn't. Why? Because Matthias was an Aboriginal Australian in an era of systemic racial discrimination. He couldn't officially enlist in the military despite his willingness to serve. He worked as a bodyguard to Corporal Moore, an unofficial but crucial role, but he never received the recognition that a white Australian soldier would have received for the same achievement. He remained relatively obscure for decades. Matthias Ulungura died in 1980. 5 years later, in 1985, a memorial cairn was finally erected in his honor. It took 31 years after the war ended for even this basic recognition. It wasn't until 2016, 74 years after the capture, that a bronze statue of Matthias Ulungura was erected on Bathurst Island. 74 years for a statue honoring the man who made one of the most dramatic individual captures in Australia's World War II history. That delay is a stain on the historical record. It's a reminder that even heroism couldn't overcome the racial barriers of the time. But here's what we can do now. We can tell his story. We can make sure Matthias Ulungura's name is remembered alongside the Cowra Breakout, alongside Hardy and Jones, alongside all the figures in this incredible chapter of history. That's why videos like this matter. That's why sharing these stories matters. Recognition delayed is injustice, but recognition achieved, even decades later, still has meaning. Let me quickly recap what we've covered in the last 30 minutes, because this is a story with layers most people have never heard. February 19th, 1942. Matthias Ulungura, A Tiwi Islander, barred from official military service, captured elite Japanese naval aviator Hajime Toyoshima with a Tomahawk on Melville Island, making him Australia's first Japanese POW of World War II. Toyoshima, living under the alias Tadao Minami because capture was so shameful, was sent to Cowra POW camp by January 1943. By August 1944, 1,104 Japanese prisoners in Compound B were ready to attempt the largest POW escape in World War II history. On August 5th at 2 a.m., Toyoshima sounded a bugle, triggering coordinated assault with improvised weapons, fires, and banzai charges. Privates Benjamin Gower Hardy and Ralph Jones manned a Vickers machine gun, held their position against overwhelming numbers, and before they were killed, disabled the weapon to prevent it from being used against other defenders. They were posthumously awarded the George Cross. Nearly 400 prisoners escaped into the Australian countryside. All were recaptured within 9 to 10 days. 231 Japanese prisoners were killed or committed suicide. 108 were wounded. 4 Australian soldiers died, including Hardy and Jones. Toyoshima died in the breakout and was buried under his false name. His true identity wasn't discovered until the 1960s. In 1963, Australia gave land for a Japanese war cemetery at Cowra. In 1978, they built the largest Japanese garden in the Southern Hemisphere as a symbol of reconciliation. And Matthias Ulungura, whose Tomahawk capture started this entire chain of events, finally received a statue in 2016, 74 years after his historic achievement. You now know a story that connects Indigenous Australian courage, Japanese military culture, Australian sacrifice, and post-war reconciliation across decades. You understand how one man with a traditional weapon captured an elite pilot, how that pilot led the largest prison escape of World War II, and how former enemies transformed tragedy into friendship. Here's what I want you to do right now. First, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We uncover forgotten histories like this every week, and you don't want to miss them. Second, drop a comment and tell me what part of this story hit you hardest. Was it Matthias Ulungura's Tomahawk capture, Hardy and Jones's sacrifice, the reconciliation that followed? I read every comment, and your perspectives add so much to these discussions. Third, share this video with someone who loves history. The Cowra Breakout deserves to be remembered. The heroes deserve to be honored. And the reconciliation deserves to be celebrated as an example of how former enemies can build peace. In my next video, I'm revealing another World War II story that will blow your mind. It involves a prisoner exchange, a ship full of civilians, and a tragedy that killed more people than the Titanic, but somehow got forgotten by history. You won't believe what happened. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. The Cowra Breakout reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles. It's individual courage, it's cultural complexity, it's sacrifice and reconciliation. It's Matthias Ulungura with a Tomahawk facing an armed pilot. It's Hardy and Jones disabling a machine gun with their last breath. It's Australia and Japan building a garden where once there was only conflict. Thank you for spending these 30 minutes with me, diving into this incredible story. Remember these names, remember these heroes, and remember that even the darkest chapters of history can lead to light if we're willing to honor the past and build a better future. I'll see you in the next one.